Robert Martinez never imagined that the young man he'd welcomed into his family with open arms would become the architect of his greatest humiliation. At 72 years old, the retired fire chief had seen his share of battles, but nothing prepared him for the war that would unfold in his own living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon in March. What started as a simple family gathering would transform into a revelation so shocking that it would shake the very foundation of everything he believed about loyalty, respect, and family bonds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Robert Martinez had spent 43 years running into burning buildings when everyone else was running out. As fire chief of Riverside County, he'd earned the respect of his community through decades of selfless service. But his greatest pride wasn't the commendations hanging on his wall or the key to the city gathering dust in his study. His greatest achievement was watching his daughter Elena grow from a spirited little girl who used to slide down the fire station poles into a successful pediatric nurse with a heart as big as Texas. The small ranch house on Maple Street had been Robert's sanctuary since his wife Carmen passed away 8 years ago. Every morning he'd sit on the front porch with his coffee, watching the neighborhood come alive, grateful for the peaceful retirement he'd earned through years of dedication. The house might have seemed too big for one man, but Robert had filled it with purpose. The spare bedroom served as his workshop where he crafted wooden toys for the children's hospital. The garage had been converted into a small gym where he maintained the physical fitness that had kept him alive through 4 decades of dangerous rescues. When Elena brought Marcus home for the first time 3 years ago, Robert had been cautiously optimistic. The young man worked in finance, spoke confidently about his career prospects, and seemed genuinely smitten with Elena. Marcus had the kind of polished charm that impressed people at dinner parties, with his expensive suits and knowledge of wine that he'd acquired during his MBA program. He knew exactly what to say and when to say it, a skill that had served him well in his climb up the corporate ladder. The wedding had been everything Elena dreamed of. Robert walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, remembering how she used to dress up in her mother's old wedding dress when she was 7 years old. Marcus had spared no expense, flying in flowers from Ecuador and hiring a string quartet that had performed at Carnegie Hall. The reception was held at the grand ballroom of the Riverside Resort, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbow patterns across the dance floor where Robert spun his daughter in the same gentle circles he'd used when teaching her to dance in their living room 15 years earlier. As the newlyweds settled into their life together, Robert made every effort to be the father-in-law he wished he'd had. He never showed up unannounced, always called before visiting, and kept his opinions to himself when Marcus made decisions that seemed impractical. When they bought their first house, a modern, minimalist structure in the upscale Willowbrook development, Robert bit his tongue about the astronomical mortgage payment that consumed nearly 60% of their combined income. When Marcus insisted on leasing 2 luxury cars instead of buying reliable used vehicles, Robert reminded himself that every generation had to learn financial wisdom through their own mistakes. The first sign of trouble came during Thanksgiving dinner last year. Elena had been working double shifts at the hospital, covering for colleagues who'd fallen ill during the seasonal flu outbreak. She looked exhausted as she tried to coordinate the meal preparation, while Marcus sat in the living room scrolling through his phone and complaining about the football game. When Robert offered to help with the turkey, Marcus had made a comment about how his own father would never be caught dead in a kitchen, as if Robert's willingness to help was somehow emasculating rather than considerate. Robert had shrugged off the comment at the time, attributing it to generational differences or perhaps stress from Marcus's demanding job at the investment firm. But as the months passed, he began noticing a pattern in Marcus's behavior. The young man seemed to view any gesture of kindness or assistance as a sign of weakness rather than love. When Robert offered to help them move furniture, Marcus declined with a dismissive wave, saying they'd hire professionals rather than risk injury to someone his age. When Elena mentioned that her father had offered to help with their landscaping, Marcus had laughed and said he'd prefer to hire someone who actually knew what they were doing. The tension came to a head on a seemingly ordinary Sunday in March. Elena had invited her father over for dinner, one of their monthly traditions that had continued even after her marriage. Robert arrived at 5 o'clock sharp, carrying a bouquet of daisies he'd picked from his own garden and a wooden puzzle he'd crafted for their neighbor's new baby. Elena greeted him with her usual warm hug, but Robert noticed the dark circles under her eyes and the way her smile didn't quite reach the corners of her mouth. Marcus was in the living room, spread across the leather sectional that had cost more than Robert's monthly pension check. He was simultaneously watching a basketball game, checking his laptop, and scrolling through his phone, the modern picture of divided attention. When Robert entered the room, Marcus glanced up with the kind of forced smile that people reserve for door-to-door salesmen. Dinner conversation was stilted, filled with awkward pauses and subjects that seemed to die natural deaths. Elena tried to keep things light, asking about Robert's volunteer work at the community center and sharing stories from her shifts at the hospital. Marcus contributed little beyond grunts of acknowledgement and complaints about his workload. When Elena mentioned that her father had been helping elderly neighbors with yard work, Marcus's expression shifted to something resembling disdain. After dinner, as Elena loaded the dishwasher, Robert offered to help clear the table. That's when Marcus finally found his voice, and the words that tumbled out would forever change the dynamic of their family. Marcus leaned back in his chair, gesturing towards Robert with his wine glass in a way that felt deliberately dismissive. The words came out smooth and casual, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than delivering a crushing blow to a man who'd spent his life serving others. "You know, Robert, I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I feel like I need to be honest with you. This whole thing where you're constantly trying to help everyone, constantly inserting yourself into situations, it's becoming a real burden. Elena and I are trying to build our own life, and frankly, having you always hovering around, always offering to fix things or help with things, it makes us look like we can't handle our own responsibilities." Robert felt the words hit him like a physical blow. In 43 years of emergency response, he'd faced situations that would have broken lesser men, but nothing had prepared him for the casual cruelty in his son-in-law's voice. Elena dropped the plate she had been holding, the ceramic shattering against the kitchen tiles in a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Marcus continued, apparently oblivious to the devastation his words were causing. "I mean, we appreciate everything you've done, don't get me wrong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But at some point, you need to understand that constantly needing to feel needed is just another form of selfishness. Elena and I have talked about this, and we think it would be better if you gave us some space to figure things out on our own." Robert looked toward his daughter, hoping to see some sign that Marcus was speaking only for himself, but Elena's face had gone pale, and she was staring at the broken plate as if it contained the secrets of the universe. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, trapped between loyalty to her father and whatever private conversations she'd had with her husband. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Robert stood up slowly, his 72-year-old joints protesting the sudden movement, and walked to the kitchen, where Elena was still frozen in place. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder and kissed the top of her head, the same gesture he'd used to comfort her when she was a child, waking from nightmares. Robert gathered his jacket from the hall closet and headed toward the front door, his steps measured and dignified despite the chaos raging in his chest. As he reached for the doorknob, Marcus called out from the dining room, his tone suggesting he thought he was being generous. "Look, Robert, don't take this personally. It's just time for everyone to grow up a little bit. You'll thank us for this eventually." Robert paused with his hand on the doorknob. 43 years of leadership and crisis management warring with the hurt and confusion that threatened to overwhelm him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady, carrying the authority that had commanded respect from firefighters and city officials for decades. Marcus, in all my years of service, I learned that a real man doesn't mistake kindness for weakness or confuse independence with ingratitude. I also learned that sometimes the biggest fires start with the smallest sparks. He walked out into the cool March evening, closing the door gently behind him despite every instinct telling him to slam it hard enough to rattle the expensive windows. As he drove home through the quiet streets of his neighborhood, Robert found himself replaying not just the evening's conversation, but months of subtle slights and dismissive comments that now seemed to form a deliberate pattern. That night, Robert sat in his workshop until well past midnight, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of sanding and shaping wood while his mind processed what had happened. The smell of cedar shavings and the rhythmic motion of his work had always helped him think through complicated problems, and tonight's problem was more complicated than any he'd faced in his professional career. Marcus had called him a burden, but Robert knew burden was just another word for responsibility, and he'd never shied away from responsibility in his life. The question now was what responsibilities he still had toward a family that apparently viewed his love and support as unwelcome interference. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady, carrying the authority that had commanded respect from firefighters and city officials for decades. Marcus, in all my years of service, I learned that a real man doesn't mistake kindness for weakness or confuse independence with ingratitude. I also learned that sometimes the biggest fires start with the smallest sparks. He walked out into the cool March evening, closing the door gently behind him despite every instinct telling him to slam it hard enough to rattle the expensive windows. As he drove home through the quiet streets of his neighborhood, Robert found himself replaying not just the evening's conversation, but months of subtle slights and dismissive comments that now seemed to form a deliberate pattern. That night, Robert sat in his workshop until well past midnight, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of sanding and shaping wood while his mind processed what had happened. The smell of cedar shavings and the rhythmic motion of his work had always helped him think through complicated problems, and tonight's problem was more complicated than any he'd faced in his professional career. Marcus had called him a burden, but Robert knew burden was just another word for responsibility, and he'd never shied away from responsibility in his life. The question now was what responsibilities he still had toward a family that apparently viewed his love and support as unwelcome interference. As the clock struck 1 in the morning, Robert set down his sandpaper and made a decision that would change everything. If Marcus wanted to understand what a real burden looked like, Robert was prepared to give him a comprehensive education. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with, and that meant paying closer attention to the life his daughter and son-in-law had built together. Over the next few days, Robert found himself noticing things he'd previously overlooked, patterns of behavior and attitude that painted a very different picture of Marcus than the successful young professional he'd pretended to be. The first revelation came from Elena herself, though she didn't realize what she was revealing. When she called to apologize for the uncomfortable dinner, she mentioned that Marcus had been under a lot of stress at work. There had been some restructuring at the investment firm, and several people in his department had been let go. Marcus was working longer hours and bringing more work home, trying to prove his value to the company. Robert listened with the patience that had served him well in countless emergency situations, but his firefighter's instinct for reading between the lines was picking up signals that Elena either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. The stress she described sounded less like the pressure of the successful professional and more like the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. A conversation with his neighbor, Janet Peterson, provided another piece of the puzzle. Janet worked as a loan officer at the bank where Marcus and Elena had their mortgage, and while she couldn't share specific details about their account, she mentioned in passing that several young couples in the Willowbrook development were struggling to keep up with payments. The houses had been priced at the peak of the market, and many buyers had stretched their finances to the breaking point. Robert began taking longer walks through Elena's neighborhood, not to spy, but to observe. The minimalist house that had seemed so impressive 3 years ago now showed signs of deferred maintenance. The lawn was patchy and overgrown, the kind of neglect that suggested either financial constraints or simple lack of care. The luxury cars in the driveway looked pristine, but Robert noticed that they rarely left the garage except for essential trips. More troubling were the glimpses he caught of his daughter during his walks. Elena had always been energetic and vibrant, but now she looked tired even on her days off. She moved with the careful precision of someone conserving energy, and her usual animated gestures had been replaced by a more subdued demeanor. When she thought no one was looking, her face settled into lines of worry that had no business appearing on the features of a 31-year-old woman. Robert's investigation took on a more systematic approach as he utilized skills he'd developed during his years in emergency management. He began keeping a notebook, recording observations and conversations that individually seemed insignificant, but together painted a picture of a young couple living far beyond their means and a marriage showing signs of serious strain. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Hernandez had been Elena's pediatric supervisor for 5 years, and she and Robert had developed a friendship based on their shared concern for Elena's well-being. During a chance encounter at the grocery store, Patricia mentioned that Elena had been picking up extra shifts and even inquired about overtime opportunities in other departments. Patricia assumed Elena was saving money for something special, perhaps a vacation or home improvements, but Robert recognized the desperation of someone trying to keep their head above water financially. Elena had never been motivated by money. She'd chosen pediatric nursing because she loved working with children, not because it offered the highest salary. If she was suddenly focused on maximizing her income, something was seriously wrong. Robert spent the next week making discreet inquiries among his network of contacts in the community. Riverside was small enough that people knew each other's business, especially when that business involved financial difficulties or marital problems. What he learned painted a disturbing picture of Marcus's true character and the real state of his marriage to Elena. The investment firm where Marcus worked had indeed undergone restructuring, but Marcus's position was more precarious than Elena realized. Several sources confirmed that Marcus had been struggling to meet his performance targets for months before the layoffs began. His expensive lifestyle had been funded largely through credit and loans rather than actual income, a house of cards that was becoming increasingly unstable. More disturbing were the stories about Marcus's behavior toward Elena in social situations. Friends reported seeing him dismiss her opinions in public, criticize her appearance when he thought no one was listening, and generally treat her more like a personal assistant than a partner. The charming facade he'd maintained during their courtship had given way to a pattern of emotional manipulation and control. Robert realized that Marcus's declaration that he was a burden had been more than just an expression of frustration. It had been a calculated attempt to isolate Elena from her primary source of emotional and practical support. By painting Robert's involvement in their lives as unhealthy dependence, Marcus was setting the stage to cut Elena off from the one person who might recognize the warning signs of what was really happening in their marriage. As March turned into April, Robert found himself facing a decision that would define not only his own future, but potentially his daughter's as well. He could respect Marcus's demand for distance and withdraw from Elena's life, hoping that she would eventually recognize her husband's true nature on her own. Or he could take a more active role in protecting his daughter from what he was beginning to recognize as an emotionally abusive situation wrapped in the trappings of suburban respectability. The decision crystallized on a rainy Thursday evening in mid-April, when Elena showed up at his door unannounced, soaked to the skin and shivering despite the mild spring weather. She stood on his front porch like a lost child, her usual composure completely shattered, and when Robert opened the door, she collapsed into his arms with a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Through her tears, the whole story came tumbling out. Marcus had been laid off from the investment firm 2 weeks ago, a fact he'd hidden from Elena by continuing to leave the house each morning dressed for work. She'd discovered the truth when the mortgage company called about a missed payment, and when she'd confronted Marcus, he'd exploded with a rage that had shocked her with its intensity. Marcus had blamed everyone but himself for his professional failures. His supervisors were incompetent, his colleagues had sabotaged him, and the company was too short-sighted to recognize his value. But most of his anger was directed at Elena, whom he accused of being unsupportive and putting too much pressure on him to maintain their lifestyle. The final straw had come that evening when Elena suggested they might need to sell the house and find something more affordable. Marcus had responded by calling her selfish and unrealistic, accusing her of being just like her father in her inability to understand what it took to be successful in the real world. He'd stormed out of the house, leaving Elena alone with the crushing realization that her marriage was built on lies, and her husband was nothing like the man she'd thought she'd married. As Robert held his daughter while she cried, he felt the last pieces of his own facade falling away. The patient, understanding father-in-law who'd tried to stay out of his daughter's marriage was gone, replaced by the protective father who'd do whatever it took to keep his child safe. Marcus had called him a burden, but now Robert understood that he'd been looking at the situation completely backwards. Marcus wasn't burdened by Robert's presence in their lives. Marcus was terrified of it. Robert represented everything Marcus wasn't: integrity, genuine strength, and the kind of character that couldn't be faked or bought. As long as Robert was part of Elena's life, she had a standard by which to measure her husband, and Marcus couldn't survive that comparison. Robert made Elena a cup of tea and wrapped her in one of Carmen's old quilts, the same quilt that had comforted Elena through childhood illnesses and teenage heartbreaks. As she finally began to calm down, Robert made a decision that would change everything. Marcus wanted to know what a real burden looked like, and Robert was about to show him. But this wouldn't be about revenge or petty vindication. This would be about protection, justice, and teaching a young man who'd forgotten the difference between strength and bullying exactly what those concepts really meant. The old fire chief who'd spent 43 years running toward danger when everyone else ran away was about to face his most important rescue mission, and this time the person who needed saving was his own daughter. Marcus had made the mistake of challenging a man who'd built his life on meeting challenges, and he was about to discover that some battles are won not through confrontation, but through the patient, methodical application of experience and wisdom. Robert's campaign would be subtle and strategic, designed not to destroy Marcus but to reveal him for what he really was. By the time Robert was finished, Marcus would understand the difference between being a burden and being accountable, between demanding respect and earning it, and between appearing successful and actually achieving something worthwhile. The old fire chief smiled grimly as he tucked Elena into the guest room bed, the same bed that she'd slept in during sleepovers as a child. Marcus thought he'd won by driving a wedge between father and daughter, but he had actually just sealed his own fate. Robert Martinez had 43 years of experience dealing with dangerous situations, and he was about to put every lesson he'd learned to work protecting the person who mattered most to him in the world. Through his friendship with Janet Peterson at the bank, Robert learned that Marcus and Elena's mortgage was 3 months behind, and their credit card debt had ballooned to over $60,000. The luxury cars that Marcus insisted on keeping were both leased at payments that consumed nearly a quarter of Elena's nursing salary. The couple's financial situation wasn't just precarious, it was catastrophic. More troubling was Robert's discovery that Marcus had been forging Elena's signature on loan applications and credit card agreements. Elena worked long hours at the hospital and trusted Marcus to handle their finances, a trust that he'd systematically abused to fund his expensive lifestyle. Robert had seen enough fraud investigations during his years in public service to recognize the warning signs, and Marcus's behavior fit the pattern perfectly. The investigation took a more personal turn when Robert began documenting Marcus's treatment of Elena in social situations. Robert's network of friends and community contacts provided disturbing accounts of Marcus's behavior at various events and gatherings. Sarah Chen, who worked with Elena at the hospital, described a Christmas party where Marcus had publicly criticized Elena's appearance and made jokes about her simple choice of career. Linda Rodriguez, whose husband played golf with Marcus, reported that Marcus regularly complained about Elena's lack of ambition and her family's working-class background. Most disturbing were the reports from Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who'd noticed changes in Elena's behavior at work. Elena had always been confident and assertive when advocating for her patients, but over the past year, she had become increasingly deferential and apologetic. She second-guessed decisions she would have made confidently in the past and seemed constantly worried about disappointing people. Patricia recognized these as classic signs of emotional abuse, patterns she'd seen in other nurses whose home lives were affecting their professional confidence. Robert's investigation revealed that Marcus's demands for distance from Elena's family weren't motivated by a desire for independence, but by a need to isolate Elena from people who might recognize his true character. Marcus had systematically undermined Elena's relationships with her friends and colleagues, using subtle manipulation to convince her that their concerns about him were signs of jealousy or misunderstanding. The most damaging evidence came from Marcus himself, in the form of text messages and emails that Elena had saved without realizing their significance. Robert had helped Elena organize her digital files as part of preparing for the financial crisis they were facing, and in the process, he discovered a pattern of communication that revealed Marcus's true feelings about his wife and marriage. In messages to his college roommate, Derek Hoffman, Marcus had described Elena as clingy and emotionally needy, complaining that she expected too much attention and support. He joked about her daddy issues and suggested that her close relationship with Robert was a sign of immaturity. Most telling were his comments about their financial situation, where he blamed Elena's unrealistic expectations for their debt problems, despite the fact that most of their spending had been driven by his insistence on maintaining appearances. Marcus's messages also revealed his true opinion of Robert. He described the retired fire chief as pathetic and desperate for relevance, suggesting that Robert's decades of community service were motivated by a need for attention and praise, a projection that said more about Marcus's own motivations than Robert's character. As April turned into May, Robert began to understand the full scope of Marcus's manipulation. The young man hadn't just deceived Elena about his financial situation. He'd systematically undermined her self-confidence and isolated her from her support network. The confrontation at dinner hadn't been a spontaneous expression of frustration. It had been part of a calculated campaign to cut Elena off from the one person who might help her recognize the truth about her marriage. Robert's investigation also revealed Marcus's backup plan. Through his connections in the legal community, Robert learned that Marcus had consulted with attorneys about protecting his assets in case of separation. Despite being unemployed and deeply in debt, Marcus was exploring ways to claim a portion of Elena's pension and medical benefits. He'd even researched whether he could make a case for alimony based on his alleged contributions to Elena's career advancement. The consultation with attorney Michelle Brooks had been particularly revealing. Michelle specialized in high-asset divorce cases, and she'd advised Marcus that his best strategy would be to document Elena's alleged mental health issues and family dysfunction. Marcus had actually asked whether Robert's involvement in their lives could be portrayed as evidence of Elena's inability to function independently. Michelle's notes, which Robert obtained through a former colleague who worked at her firm, showed that Marcus had been planning his exit strategy for months while continuing to deceive Elena about their finances and his employment status. Robert realized that Marcus's declaration that he was a burden had been more than just an insult. It had been the opening move in a campaign designed to discredit Robert's influence and isolate Elena before filing for divorce. Marcus had calculated that if he could convince Elena that her father's support was unhealthy dependence, she would be less likely to turn to Robert when the marriage finally collapsed. The investigation took on greater urgency when Robert discovered that Marcus had been having an affair with Rebecca Sterling, a marketing executive he'd met at a business networking event. The affair had been going on for 8 months, overlapping with the period when Marcus had been pressuring Elena to distance herself from her family. Rebecca was recently divorced, financially independent, and represented everything that Marcus thought he wanted in a partner, someone who could enhance his social status without requiring emotional support or genuine commitment. Robert's discovery of the affair came through Rebecca's social media posts, which featured photos from restaurants and events that Marcus had claimed to attend for work purposes. A private investigator friend, Tony Vasquez, confirmed the relationship through surveillance photos that showed Marcus and Rebecca entering and leaving Rebecca's downtown apartment on multiple occasions when he was supposed to be job searching. The affair explained Marcus's increasing hostility toward Elena and his eagerness to blame her for their marital problems. In his mind, Elena's emotional needs and family connections were obstacles preventing him from pursuing his relationship with Rebecca. By portraying Elena as clingy and dependent, Marcus was building a case for why their marriage had failed and why he deserved to move on to someone more compatible with his ambitions. Robert's investigation revealed the full extent of Marcus's deception and manipulation, but it also presented him with a difficult decision. He could simply share this information with Elena and let her decide how to proceed, or he could take a more active role in exposing Marcus and protecting his daughter from further harm. The fire chief in him wanted to charge in and rescue Elena immediately, but his experience had taught him that the most effective interventions were often the most carefully planned ones. Robert decided that simply revealing Marcus's lies wouldn't be enough. Elena had been psychologically manipulated for months, and she would need time and support to fully understand the extent of her husband's betrayal. More importantly, Marcus needed to face consequences for his actions that went beyond just losing his marriage. The young man had built his life on deception and exploitation, and he'd caused serious harm not just to Elena, but to clients and colleagues who'd trusted him. Robert began developing a comprehensive strategy that would expose Marcus's deceptions while providing Elena with the evidence and support she needed to protect herself legally and financially. The plan would require patience and precision, but Robert had both in abundance. Marcus had called him a burden, but Robert was about to demonstrate that some burdens were worth carrying because they came with the strength and determination to right serious wrongs. The first phase of Robert's counterattack focused on Marcus's financial fraud. Robert worked with Elena to document every forged signature and unauthorized transaction, building a case that could be presented to both the police and the civil courts. Elena was initially reluctant to take legal action against her husband, but Robert helped her understand that Marcus's financial crimes weren't just betrayals of trust, they were serious felonies that could have lasting consequences for her credit and financial future. Robert also began reaching out to Marcus's former clients and colleagues, not to gossip or spread rumors, but to document the pattern of unethical behavior that had led to his termination. Dr. Morrison was willing to provide a written statement about Marcus's investment recommendations, and several other clients came forward with similar stories of poor advice and manipulative sales tactics. Robert's goal wasn't to destroy Marcus's reputation, but to ensure that his true character was known to people who might otherwise become his victims. The investigation into Marcus's affair provided Robert with additional leverage. While adultery wasn't grounds for criminal charges, It would be relevant in divorce proceedings, particularly if Marcus tried to claim that Elena's family relationships were responsible for their marital problems. Robert's evidence would make it clear that Marcus had been the one undermining their marriage through deception and infidelity. Robert's strategy also included rebuilding Elena's confidence and support network. He encouraged her to reconnect with friends and colleagues whom Marcus had convinced her to avoid, and he helped her recognize the patterns of manipulation that had made her question her own judgment. Elena began attending counseling sessions with Dr. Patricia Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in helping victims of emotional abuse recognize and overcome the psychological effects of manipulation. As May progressed, Robert's investigation expanded to include Marcus's new relationship with Rebecca Sterling. Through Tony Vasquez's surveillance work, Robert learned that Marcus had been presenting himself to Rebecca as a successful investor who was going through a difficult divorce from an emotionally unstable wife. He had told Rebecca that Elena was financially irresponsible and had mental health issues that made their marriage impossible to salvage. Rebecca had been sympathetic to Marcus's fabricated story, even offering to help him find employment opportunities through her marketing connections. She'd introduced him to several potential employers, unaware that his termination from Westfield Investments had been performance-related rather than the result of office politics as Marcus had claimed. Robert realized that Rebecca was as much a victim of Marcus's deception as Elena had been. The marketing executive was a successful professional who believed she was helping a good man escape a bad situation, when in reality she was enabling a fraud to continue his pattern of manipulation and exploitation. Robert faced a difficult decision about whether to inform Rebecca of Marcus's true character or to use her unknowing participation in his deceptions as additional evidence of his willingness to lie to anyone who might be useful to him. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Robert discovered that Marcus had been stealing from Elena in ways that went beyond forged signatures and unauthorized credit applications. Marcus had been systematically taking cash from Elena's purse and personal accounts, small amounts that Elena had attributed to her own absent-mindedness or miscounting. Over the course of their marriage, these thefts had totaled several $1,000s, money that Marcus had used to fund his relationship with Rebecca. More seriously, Marcus had been selling items from their home and keeping the proceeds for himself. Elena's jewelry, inherited from her grandmother, had been replaced with costume replicas that Marcus claimed were being cleaned or repaired. Electronic equipment and collectibles had disappeared from their home, with Marcus explaining their absence through stories about loans to friends or storage for safekeeping. Robert's investigation revealed that Marcus had established a pattern of financial abuse that extended far beyond their joint accounts. He'd been systematically stripping Elena of her personal assets while simultaneously destroying their shared financial security. The young man who'd accused Robert of being a burden had actually been parasitically feeding off Elena's earnings and savings while contributing nothing of value to their partnership. As the investigation progressed, Robert began to understand that Marcus's hostility toward him wasn't just about control or manipulation. It was about fear. Marcus recognized that Robert represented a threat to his carefully constructed web of lies. The retired fire chief had the experience and connections necessary to uncover the truth about Marcus's character and behavior, and Marcus knew that his deceptions couldn't survive that level of scrutiny. Robert's decades of emergency response had taught him to recognize the signs of impending collapse in dangerous situations, and Marcus's life was showing all those warning signs. The unemployed fraud was running out of money, his relationship with Elena was deteriorating, and his affair with Rebecca was based on lies that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Marcus was heading for a catastrophic failure, and Robert was determined to ensure that Elena wasn't caught in the wreckage. The investigation phase of Robert's campaign was nearing completion, and he was ready to move into the next stage of his plan. Marcus had wanted to know what a real burden looked like, and Robert was prepared to show him. But first, Marcus needed to understand that his actions had consequences, and that the man he'd tried to dismiss as a meddling old fool was actually a formidable opponent with the skills and determination to hold him accountable for every lie he'd told and every dollar he'd stolen. Robert's strategy for the next phase would be subtle but devastating. Rather than confronting Marcus directly, Robert would systematically remove the pillars supporting his fraudulent lifestyle. The lies Marcus had told would be exposed to the people who mattered most. The stolen money would be documented and recovered. The forged signatures would be reported to the appropriate authorities. And the affair that Marcus thought was his escape route would become another example of his willingness to deceive anyone who trusted him. Marcus made the mistake of challenging a man who'd spent his career dealing with liars, cheats, and frauds. Robert had seen every type of criminal and con artist during his decades in public service, and Marcus wasn't particularly sophisticated or original in his approach. The young man's arrogance had made him sloppy, and his sloppiness would be his downfall. Robert's investigation had revealed that Marcus was essentially a house of cards held together by deception and maintained through psychological manipulation. All Robert needed to do was remove the right support, and the entire structure would collapse under its own weight. Marcus would learn that being a burden meant being someone who contributed nothing while taking everything they could get their hands on. Robert, on the other hand, was about to demonstrate what it meant to be a force for justice and protection, even when that meant carrying the weight of difficult decisions and painful confrontations. The old fire chief smiled grimly as he reviewed his notes one final time. Marcus had thought he was clever in trying to isolate Elena from her primary source of support and protection, but Marcus had underestimated both Robert's capabilities and Elena's strength.
The young man was about to discover that some people couldn't be intimidated or manipulated, and that actions really did have consequences, even when those consequences took time to arrive. Robert's campaign of exposure and accountability was about to begin in earnest, and Marcus would learn that the man he'd dismissed as a burden was actually someone who'd spent his life carrying responsibilities that Marcus couldn't even imagine. The fire chief who'd run toward danger for 4 decades was about to face his most important rescue mission. And this time, saving Elena would require destroying the lies and deceptions that Marcus had built his entire adult life upon. Robert's plan reached its crescendo on a humid Tuesday morning in late June when Marcus received a certified letter that would shatter his carefully constructed facade forever. The letter, delivered by a process server who'd been waiting outside the Willowbrook house since dawn, contained documents that would expose every lie Marcus had told and every crime he'd committed over the past 2 years. But the letter was just the opening move in a chess game that Robert had been planning for weeks, and Marcus was about to discover that he'd been outmaneuvered by a master strategist. Elena had spent the previous evening at her father's house, finally ready to face the truth about her marriage and take the legal steps necessary to protect herself. With Dr. Patricia Martinez's help, she'd come to understand that Marcus's behavior wasn't the result of stress or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate pattern of abuse and exploitation that had been escalating for months. The woman who'd once made excuses for her husband's cruelty now saw it for what it truly was, and she was ready to fight back. The certified letter contained a civil lawsuit filed by Elena against Marcus for fraud, theft, and conversion of marital assets. Robert had worked with attorney David Chen, Sarah's husband and one of the most respected family law practitioners in Riverside County, to build a case that would not only recover Elena's stolen assets, but also establish a clear record of Marcus's criminal behavior. The lawsuit detailed every forged signature, every unauthorized transaction, and every piece of stolen property, backed by bank records, receipts, and witness statements that Marcus would be unable to dispute. But the civil lawsuit was only the beginning of Marcus's legal troubles. Robert had also filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office, supported by evidence that clearly demonstrated Marcus had committed multiple felonies. The forged signatures alone were enough to warrant charges of identity theft and fraud, crimes that carried significant prison sentences and would permanently destroy any hope Marcus had of rebuilding his financial career. Marcus's reaction to the legal documents was exactly what Robert had anticipated. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, Marcus immediately began trying to shift blame and manipulate the situation to his advantage. He called Elena's phone 17 times in the first hour after receiving the lawsuit, leaving increasingly desperate and angry voicemails that only served to strengthen Elena's resolve to see the legal process through to completion. When Elena refused to return his calls, Marcus showed up at the hospital where she worked, demanding to speak with her and causing such a disturbance that security had to escort him from the premises. His public breakdown in front of Elena's colleagues only reinforced the wisdom of Robert's decision to document everything and prepare for the worst possible scenarios. Marcus's next move was to contact Rebecca Sterling and try to convince her to provide him with financial support while he fought the charges. But Robert had anticipated this possibility and had already arranged for Rebecca to receive a comprehensive dossier documenting Marcus's pattern of deception and manipulation. The marketing executive was shocked to learn that the man she'd been dating was not only married, but also a fraud and a thief who'd been lying to her about every aspect of his life. Rebecca's reaction was swift and decisive. She not only ended her relationship with Marcus immediately, but also provided Robert with additional evidence of Marcus's lies, including recordings of conversations where Marcus had made false claims about his employment status and financial situation. Rebecca had unknowingly been documenting Marcus's deceptions for months, and her evidence would prove invaluable in both the civil and criminal proceedings against him. The exposure of Marcus's affair had devastating consequences for his attempts to portray himself as the victim in his failing marriage. His lawyer, Eugene Patterson, had initially planned to argue that Elena's family relationships were evidence of her inability to function independently in a marriage. But Marcus's own infidelity made that strategy impossible, and Patterson was forced to focus on damage control rather than offense. Marcus's financial situation collapsed completely when his creditors learned about the pending criminal charges. The credit card companies froze his accounts and demanded immediate payment of outstanding balances. The leasing companies for his luxury cars repossessed both vehicles within the same week, leaving Marcus stranded and unable to maintain even the appearance of success that had been so important to his self-image. More significantly, Marcus's unemployment benefits were suspended when the state learned that he'd been fraudulently claiming job search activities while actually spending his time pursuing his affair with Rebecca. The young man who had accused Robert of being a burden suddenly found himself genuinely dependent on others for the first time in his adult life, and the experience was humbling in ways he'd never imagined possible. Robert's strategy for dealing with Marcus extended beyond legal consequences to include social and professional accountability. Through his network of contacts in the business community, Robert ensured that Marcus's true character became known to potential employers and professional associates. The story of Marcus's fraud and manipulation spread quickly through Riverside's tight-knit business community, effectively ending any hope he had of rebuilding his career in the area. Dr. Morrison and the other clients who'd been victimized by Marcus's poor investment advice came forward to share their experiences, creating a pattern of unethical behavior that extended far beyond his marriage to Elena. The State Securities Commission opened an investigation into Marcus's conduct at Westfield Investments, and several clients filed complaints that could result in additional civil penalties and professional sanctions. Marcus's attempts to rebuild his life were systematically frustrated by the consequences of his own actions. Every job application was rejected once potential employers learned about the pending criminal charges. Every apartment rental was denied once landlords discovered his financial history and legal troubles. Even his attempts to return to his parents' home in another state were complicated by the conditions of his bail, which required him to remain in Riverside County until his criminal case was resolved. The young man who'd once been so confident in his ability to manipulate and control others now found himself completely isolated and powerless. His friends and colleagues distanced themselves from him once they learned about his crimes. His family was embarrassed by his behavior and unwilling to provide the financial support he desperately needed. Even his own lawyer seemed increasingly pessimistic about his chances of avoiding serious legal consequences. Robert watched Marcus's downfall with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He took no pleasure in seeing another human being suffer, but he recognized that Marcus's consequences were entirely self-inflicted and necessary to prevent him from victimizing others in the future. The man who'd called Robert a burden was learning what it really meant to be dependent on others while contributing nothing of value to their lives. Elena's recovery from the psychological effects of Marcus's abuse was gradual but steady. With Dr. Martinez's help, she began to understand how Marcus had systematically undermined her confidence and isolated her from her support network. The process of recognizing and overcoming the effects of emotional manipulation was painful, but Elena approached it with the same determination she'd always shown in her nursing career.
Robert provided unwavering support throughout Elena's healing process, but he was careful not to make the same mistakes Marcus had made by trying to control or direct her decisions. Instead, he offered guidance when asked and practical assistance when needed, while always respecting Elena's autonomy and encouraging her to trust her own judgment. The civil lawsuit against Marcus proceeded smoothly once his financial records were subpoenaed and examined by forensic accountants. The evidence of his theft and fraud was overwhelming, and his own lawyer advised him to settle rather than risk a trial that would only expose additional evidence of his criminal behavior. Marcus was forced to surrender what few assets he still controlled and agreed to a payment plan for the money he'd stolen but already spent. More importantly, the civil proceedings established a clear legal record of Marcus's abuse and manipulation that would protect Elena in any future interactions with him. The restraining order that accompanied the settlement prohibited Marcus from contacting Elena or coming within 500 feet of her home or workplace, violations that would result in immediate imprisonment. The criminal case against Marcus was resolved through a plea agreement that required him to serve 18 months in county jail and pay full restitution to Elena for his thefts. The felony convictions would remain on his record permanently, ensuring that future employers and romantic partners would have access to information about his true character. Marcus would also be required to attend counseling for domestic abusers and financial criminals, programs designed to address the underlying attitudes and behaviors that had led to his crimes. Marcus's sentencing hearing provided Robert and Elena with an opportunity to address the court about the impact of his crimes on their family. Elena spoke eloquently about the psychological damage caused by Marcus's manipulation and abuse, while Robert testified about the broader pattern of deception and exploitation that Marcus had used against multiple victims. Marcus himself offered a brief apology that rang hollow and self-serving, focusing more on his own difficult circumstances than on the harm he'd caused to others. His lack of genuine remorse convinced the judge to impose the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement, and Marcus was taken into custody immediately rather than being allowed to remain free pending the start of his jail term. The resolution of the legal proceedings marked the beginning of a new chapter in Robert and Elena's relationship. The crisis had brought them closer together and had demonstrated the strength of their bond in ways that ordinary circumstances never could have revealed. Elena's respect for her father had deepened as she witnessed his strategic thinking and unwavering commitment to protecting her, while Robert's pride in his daughter had grown as he watched her overcome adversity with grace and determination. Robert's investigation and response to Marcus's abuse had also earned him recognition within the community as someone willing to stand up for victims of fraud and manipulation. Several other families approached him for advice when they discovered similar patterns of abuse in their own relationships, and Robert found himself becoming an unofficial advocate for people who needed help navigating complex legal and financial situations. The experience had also taught Robert valuable lessons about the difference between being helpful and being manipulated. Marcus's accusation that Robert was a burden had initially stung because it contained a grain of truth. Robert did find purpose and meaning in helping others, and he had sometimes struggled with boundaries in his eagerness to be useful. But the crisis had shown him that there was a fundamental difference between offering support to people who appreciated it and being exploited by people who saw kindness as weakness. Elena's career flourished in the aftermath of her divorce as she regained the confidence that Marcus had systematically destroyed. She was promoted to a senior position in the pediatric unit and began pursuing additional certifications that would expand her expertise and increase her earning potential. The financial security that Marcus had threatened through his reckless spending and theft was gradually restored through Elena's hard work and careful planning. More importantly, Elena began dating again, but with a much clearer understanding of what constituted healthy relationship dynamics. Her experience with Marcus had taught her to recognize the warning signs of manipulation and control, and she was determined never again to compromise her values or well-being for someone who didn't deserve her trust. Robert's own life was enriched by his deeper relationship with Elena and by his growing reputation as someone who could be counted on to help when help was truly needed. His workshop became a gathering place for friends and neighbors who valued his wisdom and practical skills. And his volunteer work at the community center expanded to include financial literacy classes for young adults who wanted to avoid the mistakes that Marcus had made. The man who'd been called a burden had proven himself to be exactly the opposite, a source of strength, wisdom, and protection for people who needed all three. Robert's response to Marcus's attack had demonstrated that true strength didn't come from intimidation or manipulation, but from the patient application of knowledge, experience, and moral courage. 2 years after Marcus's sentencing, Robert received an unexpected letter from his former son-in-law. Marcus was scheduled for release from jail in 6 months and wanted to express his gratitude for the lessons he had learned during his incarceration. The letter claimed that his time in jail had given him perspective on his past behavior, and that he now understood the difference between being a burden and being a contributor to society. Robert read the letter with skepticism, recognizing the same manipulative language patterns that had characterized Marcus's previous attempts to avoid responsibility for his actions. But he also recognized that people could change, and he was willing to give Marcus the benefit of the doubt if his future behavior demonstrated genuine growth rather than continued manipulation. Elena's reaction to Marcus's letter was more cautious than her father's, reflecting the deeper wounds that his abuse had left on her psyche. She was willing to forgive Marcus for her own peace of mind, but she had no interest in rebuilding any kind of relationship with him. The legal protections that remained in place would ensure that Marcus couldn't contact her directly, and Elena was confident that she would recognize and resist any future attempts at manipulation. Robert's response to Marcus's letter was characteristically thoughtful and measured. He acknowledged Marcus's claimed growth while making it clear that any future relationship would depend entirely on Marcus's actions rather than his words. Robert had learned not to trust people who'd proven themselves capable of systematic deception, but he also believed in the possibility of redemption for those who genuinely committed themselves to change. The experience with Marcus had taught Robert that being called a burden by someone whose opinion didn't matter was far less significant than being valued by people whose judgment he respected. Elena's gratitude for his protection and support meant more to him than Marcus's insults ever could have hurt him. The community's recognition of his contributions to their safety and well-being validated the choices he had made throughout his career and retirement. Robert's workshop had become a symbol of his approach to life, a place where broken things were repaired, where useful items were created, and where people could find help when help was truly needed. The wooden toys he crafted for sick children brought joy to families facing their worst fears. The furniture he restored for elderly neighbors helped them maintain their independence and dignity. The financial advice he provided to young couples helped them avoid the mistakes that had destroyed Marcus's life. The wooden sign above Robert's workshop door bore a simple inscription that he'd carved himself: "Everyone deserves help when they need it most." The words reflected his philosophy of life and his commitment to being the kind of person who made the world a better place through his presence rather than worse through his absence. Marcus had learned the hard way that there was a fundamental difference between those two approaches to life, and the consequences of his choice would follow him for years to come. But for Robert and Elena, the future was bright with possibilities and rich with the kind of meaningful relationships that made life worth living. Robert's story had become an inspiration to others who faced similar challenges, proving that age and retirement didn't diminish a person's ability to make a difference when it mattered most. The fire chief, who'd spent 43 years running toward danger, had faced his greatest challenge in his own living room. And he'd emerged victorious, not through violence or revenge, but through patience, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to protecting the people he loved. The burden that Marcus had tried to impose on Robert's identity had been revealed as a blessing in disguise, an opportunity to demonstrate that some loads were worth carrying because they came with the strength and character necessary to bear them successfully. Robert Martinez had proven himself to be exactly the kind of man the world needed more of, and his legacy would live on through the lives he'd touched and the people he'd protected from those who would do them harm. The aftermath of Marcus's imprisonment brought unexpected challenges that tested Robert's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. While the legal victory had been satisfying and the protection of Elena complete, the ripple effects of the confrontation continued to spread through their community and family network. Robert discovered that standing up to manipulation and abuse, while morally necessary, came with its own set of complications that required the same careful navigation he'd used throughout his firefighting career. The first surprise came from Marcus's family, who had remained largely absent during the legal proceedings, but emerged from the shadows once their son was safely behind bars. Marcus's mother, Patricia Whitman, arrived in Riverside 3 weeks after the sentencing with the stated intention of making things right between the families. Her actual agenda, however, quickly revealed itself to be far more self-serving and manipulative than her initial overtures suggested. Patricia was a woman in her late 60s who had spent her life enabling her son's worst tendencies while maintaining a facade of respectability in her own social circles. She'd raised Marcus to believe that charm and appearance were more important than character and integrity, values that had ultimately led to his downfall. But rather than accepting responsibility for her role in shaping Marcus's destructive worldview, Patricia had decided that Robert and Elena were the real villains in the story. Her first visit to Robert's home was a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation. Patricia arrived bearing expensive gifts and speaking in the kind of syrupy tone that immediately put Robert on guard. She expressed sympathy for the misunderstanding between Marcus and Elena, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement that her son had committed serious crimes. Instead, she suggested that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion, and that perhaps they could find a way to help Marcus rebuild his life once he was released from jail. Robert recognized the manipulation tactics immediately, having seen similar approaches from Marcus himself. Patricia was attempting to reframe her son's criminal behavior as a series of mistakes that could be forgiven and forgotten if everyone just tried harder to get along. She was particularly focused on Elena, whom she seemed to view as the key to restoring Marcus's reputation and financial security. Elena's response to Patricia's overtures was firm but polite. She explained that she had no interest in rebuilding any relationship with Marcus, and that the legal protections in place were necessary for her safety and peace of mind. Elena had learned to recognize manipulation in all its forms, and she wasn't about to be swayed by Marcus's mother's version of the same tactics her ex-husband had used. Patricia's reaction to Elena's refusal revealed the same entitled attitude that had characterized Marcus's behavior throughout their marriage. She became hostile and accusatory, suggesting that Elena was being vindictive and cruel in refusing to forgive her son's mistakes. She implied that Elena's decision to prosecute Marcus criminally had been motivated by greed rather than justice, and she made several veiled threats about what might happen if Elena continued to persecute her family. Robert's response to Patricia's threats was swift and decisive. He informed her that any further attempts to intimidate or manipulate Elena would be reported to the police as witness intimidation, a crime that could result in additional charges against Marcus for conspiracy. He also made it clear that Patricia was not welcome in his home or neighborhood, and that any future contact would be considered harassment.
Patricia's departure from Riverside was accompanied by a series of vindictive actions that demonstrated where Marcus had learned his talent for petty cruelty. She attempted to spread rumors about Elena and Robert through social media and community networks, portraying them as vindictive and unstable people who had destroyed her innocent son's life. Her efforts were largely unsuccessful, as most people in Riverside had already heard the true story of Marcus's crimes and recognized Patricia's claims as desperate fiction. More troubling was Patricia's attempt to interfere with Elena's employment at the hospital. She contacted the hospital administration with false claims about Elena's mental health and professional competence, suggesting that someone who would destroy their own family couldn't be trusted to care for sick children. The hospital's response was supportive of Elena, but the attack served as a reminder that Marcus's toxic influence extended through his entire family network. Robert's investigation into Patricia's background revealed a pattern of enabling behavior that explained much about Marcus's character development. Patricia had spent decades covering up her son's failures and making excuses for his increasingly serious misconduct. She'd bribed teachers to change his grades, paid for expensive lawyers to minimize the consequences of his college drinking incidents, and used her social connections to help him obtain jobs he wasn't qualified for. Patricia's marriage to Marcus's father had ended in divorce when Marcus was in high school, largely due to his inability to tolerate his constant excuses for their son's behavior. Marcus had learned early that his mother would always protect him from consequences, a lesson that had ultimately led to his belief that he could manipulate and exploit others without facing serious repercussions. Robert's response to Patricia's situation became a template for dealing with other toxic influences that emerged in the wake of Marcus's conviction. He developed a clear protocol for identifying and neutralizing manipulation attempts, whether they came from Marcus's associates, his family members, or even well-meaning community members who thought the whole situation had gone too far. The protocol involved 3 key elements: immediate identification of manipulative language and behavior patterns, clear communication of boundaries and consequences, and swift implementation of protective measures when those boundaries were violated. Robert had learned that people like Marcus and Patricia would continue to test limits until they encountered resistance that was both firm and consistent. Elena's growth during this period was remarkable to witness. The woman who had once made excuses for Marcus's behavior and doubted her own perceptions now displayed a confidence and clarity that impressed everyone who knew her. She'd learned to trust her instincts about people and situations, and she was no longer willing to sacrifice her well-being to avoid conflict or disappoint others. Elena's relationship with her colleagues at the hospital deepened as they witnessed her transformation from a victim of abuse to a survivor who was willing to help others recognize and escape similar situations. She began volunteering with the hospital's domestic violence support program, using her experience to help other healthcare workers identify patients who might be experiencing abuse at home.
The volunteer work was particularly meaningful for Elena because it allowed her to turn her painful experience into something positive and helpful for others. She discovered that many abuse victims felt the same isolation and self-doubt that Marcus had cultivated in her, and her story of recovery and empowerment provided hope for people who felt trapped in destructive relationships. Robert's role as an informal community resource for people dealing with fraud and manipulation expanded as word spread about his successful handling of the Marcus situation. He found himself counseling other parents whose adult children were involved with manipulative partners, helping elderly neighbors recognize and avoid financial scams, and providing guidance to people who needed to navigate complex legal situations. The workshop behind Robert's house became an unofficial meeting place for people who needed a safe space to discuss their problems and develop strategies for protecting themselves and their families. Robert's combination of practical experience, investigative skills, and genuine concern for others made him an ideal advisor for people facing situations that required both emotional support and strategic thinking. One of the most rewarding cases involved helping a young widow named Maria Santos who had become the target of a romance scam. The perpetrator had used many of the same manipulation tactics that Marcus had employed, including isolation from family and friends, financial exploitation, and psychological abuse designed to undermine Maria's confidence and judgment. Robert's investigation into Maria's situation revealed a sophisticated criminal operation that was targeting vulnerable women throughout the region. Working with local law enforcement and federal agencies, Robert helped build a case that ultimately resulted in the arrest and prosecution of multiple scammers who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from their victims. Maria's gratitude for Robert's help was deeply moving, but more importantly, her recovery from the psychological effects of the scam demonstrated that the healing process Elena had undergone wasn't unique. People who had been manipulated and exploited could regain their confidence and rebuild their lives, but they often needed support and guidance from others who understood what they had experienced. The success of Robert's informal counseling and investigation work led to an invitation to speak at the county's annual conference on elder abuse and financial fraud. His presentation on recognizing and responding to manipulation tactics was well received by law enforcement officers, social workers, and community volunteers who worked with vulnerable populations. Robert's speech emphasized the importance of taking manipulation and financial abuse seriously, regardless of whether the perpetrator was a stranger or a family member. He shared his own experience with Marcus as an example of how people who appeared successful and respectable could actually be dangerous predators who exploited the trust and affection of their victims. The conference presentation led to additional speaking opportunities at community centers, senior living facilities, and professional development workshops. Robert discovered that he had a talent for explaining complex psychological and legal concepts in ways that ordinary people could understand and apply to their own situations. Elena accompanied her father to several of these presentations, sharing her perspective as someone who had been targeted by manipulation and abuse. Her story was particularly powerful because it demonstrated that educated, successful people could also become victims of sophisticated manipulation tactics. Her message of hope and recovery resonated with audiences who might otherwise have felt ashamed or hopeless about their own situations. The father-daughter team's presentations became increasingly popular as word spread about their effectiveness in helping people recognize and respond to various forms of abuse and exploitation. They developed a series of workshops that covered topics ranging from financial fraud to emotional manipulation to legal self-protection, always emphasizing the importance of seeking help and support rather than trying to handle dangerous situations alone. Robert's retirement, which had initially seemed like a quiet chapter of woodworking and community service, had evolved into a second career focused on protecting vulnerable people from predators and manipulators. The skills he developed during his decades in emergency response translated perfectly to his new role as an advocate and educator. The transformation had been sparked by Marcus's attack on his character, but it had grown into something far more significant than a simple response to personal injury. Robert had discovered a community need that matched his particular combination of skills and experience, and he was finding deep satisfaction in his ability to make a positive difference in people's lives during their most vulnerable moments. Elena's career had similarly evolved beyond her original role as a pediatric nurse. Her experience with abuse and recovery had given her insights into the psychological and emotional needs of patients and families facing crisis situations. She'd begun pursuing additional education in trauma counseling and victim advocacy with the goal of expanding her ability to help people heal from various forms of trauma. The relationship between Robert and Elena had been strengthened and deepened by their shared experience of confronting Marcus's abuse and manipulation. They'd discovered that they made an effective team when facing challenging situations, and their mutual respect and affection had grown stronger through the process of supporting each other during difficult times. Marcus's attempt to drive a wedge between father and daughter had actually accomplished the opposite of his intended goal. Instead of isolating Elena from her primary source of support, his manipulation had revealed the strength and value of their relationship. Elena had learned that her father's involvement in her life wasn't a sign of weakness or dependence, but rather a blessing that many people never experienced. Robert had learned that his desire to help others wasn't a character flaw or a sign of neediness, but rather a natural expression of the values and skills he developed throughout his career. The man who had been called a burden had discovered that he was actually a valuable resource for people who needed protection and guidance during their darkest moments. The community's response to Robert's new role had been overwhelmingly positive. People appreciated having someone they could turn to for advice and support when facing situations that required both emotional understanding and practical expertise. Robert's reputation for integrity and effectiveness had grown stronger as more people experienced the benefits of his guidance and assistance. The transformation of Robert's retirement from peaceful solitude to active community service had been unexpected, but it had proven to be deeply fulfilling in ways he hadn't anticipated. The man who had spent his career running toward physical dangers was now running toward emotional and psychological dangers, using his experience and wisdom to help others navigate situations that could be just as destructive as any fire or emergency. Marcus's accusation that Robert was a burden seeking relevance had been revealed as projection from someone who was actually parasitic and destructive in his relationships with others. Robert's response had demonstrated the difference between genuine service and selfish manipulation, between healthy support and toxic control, and between real strength and artificial dominance. The lessons learned from the confrontation with Marcus had applications far beyond the specific situation that had triggered them. Robert and Elena had both gained insights into human nature, relationship dynamics, and the importance of maintaining clear boundaries with people who might try to exploit kindness or generosity. Their story had become an inspiration to others facing similar challenges, proof that it was possible to overcome manipulation and abuse while maintaining one's integrity and values. The man who had been called a burden had shown that some loads were worth carrying because they came with the strength and wisdom necessary to protect others from those who would do them harm. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.